Thursday mornings are supposed to be uneventful. For me, it usually means tossing on my work boots, grabbing coffee that always tastes a little burnt, and sorting through whatever junk mail has managed to find its way into my small rural mailbox. But this Thursday was different. The moment I yanked the folded newsletter out, crammed in like it owned the space, it felt somehow heavier. The bold headline across the top announced something about a community retreat at Lakeside Cabin. That title made my stomach tighten before I'd even finished skimming the first sentence. Because the Lakeside Cabin they were talking about wasn't some vague community lodge. It was my cabin, my grandfather's old fishing shack, the one I had spent 3 long years transforming piece by piece into something worth being proud of. At first, I actually thought I was reading it wrong. I stood in the driveway, morning sunlight slanting over the trees, coffee cup in one hand, newsletter in the other, squinting at the words like maybe they'd rearrange themselves into something reasonable if I blinked enough. But no, there it was, in plain print. The neighborhood retreat would take place at the Lakeside Cabin. My cabin. To hammer in the absurdity, they'd even included a neatly printed QR code for rideshare coordination, as though this wasn't theft of privacy, but careful planning. Part of me wanted to throw it away and laugh. Another part of me fought the urge to punch the side of the mailbox, because the consequences hit me instantly. If 100 people showed up at my cabin without permission, without insurance, without permits, I was the one legally on the hook. If some kid tripped over a tree root or someone broke an ankle on my porch steps, it wouldn't matter that I hadn't signed off on the gathering. The lawyers, the lawsuits, and the insurance company's refusal to cover damages would all land squarely in my lap. 100 cheerful neighbors could be turned in one afternoon into my financial ruin. I thought about what that cabin meant, the fragrance of cedar beams I'd installed myself, the dozens of weekends sanding, painting, and reinforcing walls that had stood since my grandfather had built the original shack back in the 70s. Every nail I'd driven into those boards carried meaning. It wasn't just a piece of property. It was family, memory, and sweat equity woven together, and now, by the whimsical decree of a newsletter, it was being served up as a free public park. I walked the quarter-mile gravel road leading to it later that afternoon, jangling the keys in my hand. At the end of that road stood my steel farm-style gate, heavy and simple, its locked chain a polite but firm reminder. This land belongs to someone, and that someone isn't you. The gate wasn't meant to intimidate. It was a boundary as old as property itself, but staring at it that day, imagining 100 cars pulling up with folding chairs and coolers, I knew I needed to take it seriously. I scanned the QR code with my phone, half expecting some fancy HOA event site full of itineraries and sign-up sheets. Instead, it was nothing but a blank white screen with a circle spinning endlessly, like a bad joke that didn't know when to quit. I laughed, but it came out shaky, the kind of laugh you make when you realize the joke's on you. These people had published an event for my property, invited strangers, and didn't even bother setting up a functioning website. That wasn't just sloppy. That was arrogance. By the time I returned home, my heart had calmed down enough for strategy to creep in. Anger was useless. Paperwork and planning were the weapons that mattered here. I dragged out the heavy fire-safe box from under my desk, the one holding every piece of proof I'd ever need. Property deed, boundary survey, insurance papers. I spread them across the kitchen table, the papers forming a sort of shield between me and whatever nonsense the HOA thought they were pulling. But my resolve hardened when I imagined how easily things could spiral. All it would take is one injury, one claim, and my cabin could be lost forever. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier than anger. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was survival. That night I barely slept. Every creak outside sounded like the footsteps of unwanted guests coming early. But instead of barricading the door, I planned. I decided I wouldn't wait passively for the HOA to escalate their overreach. I'd give them a trap of their own making, an opportunity to prove their legitimacy by putting their name on the paper. If they claimed authority over my property in public, then they could accept liability in writing. The next morning, I was back at the gate with a folding table, a thick manila folder, and a clear strategy. Inside the folder, in bold letters across the top, was a form labeled Event Host Authorization and Personal Liability Commitment. Beneath it, I'd placed copies of my deed, the survey lines marked in red ink, and the most important sheet, the blank space where any so-called organizer could sign away their freedom by accepting legal responsibility for insurance, permits, and claims. I clipped it open so no one could miss the message. As I sat in my truck with the sun warming my face, I noticed neighbors stopping to glance at the folder. Some frowned, others snapped pictures. Even Mrs. Henderson traced my survey lines as though memorizing the truth. I didn't need to shout. The paper spoke louder than any argument ever could. My cabin wasn't theirs, and the law proved it. That newsletter had been their opening move. But in laying claim to my property on paper, they'd given me all the proof I needed to defend it, with stronger paper, inked with law instead of arrogance. The day after that unsettling newsletter announcement, something inside me shifted. At first I'd been stunned, then angry, but now I was determined. If they wanted to drag my cabin into their community retreat fantasy, I was going to remind them whose name was on the deed. Fear of lawsuits and insurance denials wasn't just paranoia. It was reality. I'd read about too many cases where property owners lost everything. Not because they were careless, but because they didn't set hard boundaries when others tried to blur lines. I wasn't about to let years of sweat and weekends rebuilding my grandfather's cabin be undone by a printed paragraph in an HOA newsletter. That morning, I got in my truck and drove straight to the hardware store with a very specific plan. Locks weren't enough anymore. I bought tamper-proof steel cable, the kind that comes with industrial serial numbers etched on metal tags. The logic was simple. Anyone who cut that lock wouldn't just be breaking a chain. They'd be leaving behind proof of damage. Proof I could show the sheriff. Proof in court that someone had violated private property. I wasn't arming myself with weapons. I was arming myself with evidence. When I got back to the access road, I ran the new cable through the steel gate I'd installed the year before. The gate looked simple, just a farm-style metal crossbar stretching across the dirt path. But it carried a message bold enough to be heard without words. This is private property and someone cares enough to defend it. As I tightened the bolts and snapped the numbered lock into place, a surprising calm settled over me. For the first time since I'd read that newsletter, I felt less like a man under siege and more like a man in control. But the gate was just the first defensive wall. If someone was reckless enough to ignore it, the real trap would be waiting. Paperwork. That night, I sat at my kitchen table under the dim hum of a desk lamp, spreading out all my documents like a general laying out battle plans. The deed, survey maps, insurance policy, easement agreement, each sheet a weapon sharper than any blade. With deliberate precision, I put together a new document, typed in large, bold letters across the top. Event host authorization and personal liability commitment. The idea was straightforward. If the HOA president, Cynthia Pierce, or anyone claiming authority, wanted to insist my cabin could host the retreat, they'd have to do it in writing. They'd sign their name next to all the responsibilities they'd pretended didn't exist. Personal liability for insurance, permits, septic systems, and accidents. I even included direct excerpts from state property law about trespassing and unauthorized use of land. Not threatening, just factual. If they wanted authority, they could take it, but along with it came accountability. The following morning, I drove to the cabin and dragged out an old folding table I kept in the garage. I placed it right in front of the gate like a desk blocking access to a crime scene. On top of it, I clipped open the manila folder with the authorization form visible. Beneath it, I laid neatly folded copies of my deed and survey lines with bold red markers circling the exact boundaries of my land. I even tucked in a few old photographs of the cabin when it was my grandfather's shack. Black and white snapshots that served as a reminder that this wasn't just dirt and wood to me. It was history, family legacy. Then I parked my truck a few yards away and waited. The air was crisp, the morning sun slowly rising, and one by one neighbors began to walk by on their morning routine. To my amazement, most of them stopped. They bent over to read, squinted at the maps, took out their phones. Mrs. Henderson, the retired paralegal from down the street, spent nearly 10 minutes at the table tracing her finger along the survey lines. Mr. June from next door even snapped a picture of the authorization form. Their expressions weren't angry. They were puzzled, as though realizing they'd been told one story and were now seeing another entirely different version. I didn't say much. Silence was powerful here. By displaying everything openly, I was letting neighbors draw their own conclusions. The HOA had made it public by printing my property in their newsletter. I was simply responding in kind, public proof against a public lie. As I sat quietly in my truck watching the reactions, I caught myself thinking of my grandfather again. He was a man who believed strongly in respect. Respect for land, respect for hard work, respect for boundaries. If someone had tried to turn his fishing shack into a public park with nothing but a few lines of type in a community bulletin, he would have probably handled it just the way I now was, calmly but firmly, using the law as his anchor. The trap wasn't meant to scare anyone. It was meant to educate, to expose the truth. If Cynthia or anyone else came forward waving authority, I'd simply slide the folder across that table and ask them to prove it with ink. To say in writing that they accepted the liability of their claims. And if they refused to sign, which of course they would, that refusal was as loud and telling as any courtroom testimony. By the afternoon, I left the gate feeling strangely satisfied. The cable glinted under the sun, its serial tag swaying gently in the breeze. The folder's pages sat still on the table, protected in their plastic sleeves, ready for whoever dared to test me next. For the first time since this whole fiasco began, I was no longer reacting. I was on offense. The HOA had made the first move with their newsletter. Now the trap was set, the lines were drawn, and accountability was waiting quietly behind a locked gate and a manila folder. By the time I set up that folding table at my gate, I thought I was defending myself against a single outrageous stunt. One newsletter announcement gone too far. But within 24 hours, it became crystal clear that this wasn't just my battle. What Cynthia Pierce, our HOA president, had done to me was just the latest entry in a long pattern of overreach, one that had already touched more families in the neighborhood than I realized. It started with Mrs. Henderson, who showed up at my front door before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Normally she was a calm, cheerful presence, but that morning she looked more rattled than I'd ever seen her. She waved a copy of the newsletter in her hand like it was Exhibit A in some courtroom drama. "Evan," she said, skipping pleasantries, "I sent this to my daughter last night. She's a real estate attorney in the city, and she didn't mince words. She called this exactly what it is, classic authority overreach, and she says you're absolutely right to protect your property." Hearing that from a seasoned paralegal like Mrs. Henderson wasn't just reassuring, it was validating. For a moment I'd wondered if I was overreacting, if locking the gate, building an authorization folder, and staking out the property made me look like the difficult neighbor. But having another legal mind confirm the risk, that this wasn't exaggeration but real exposure to loss, strengthened my resolve. Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone, showing me a string of texts from her daughter. "She wants to know if you've documented everything, the newsletter, the QR code fiasco, any calls or communication. If this turns ugly, your paperwork may be the only thing standing between you and a very expensive lawsuit." As the weight of that truth sank in, she reminded me that lawsuits weren't theoretical. She'd seen families torn apart, savings destroyed, homes lost over simple misunderstandings that ballooned into legal disasters. That hit like a punch to the chest. The reminder that I wasn't guarding only the cabin itself, but my entire financial future. Later that morning, I decided to expand my approach. This wasn't about just one man and one property. This was about a neighborhood being manipulated by someone who believed her position gave her power without limits. If I wanted to make my case undeniable, I needed proof, not just my deed, but a pattern. So I walked next door to visit Mr. June, the quiet fellow who'd been taking pictures of my authorization table the day before. To my surprise, he didn't just sympathize. He was practically waiting for me. He invited me in, poured coffee, and pulled out his own file folder thick with notes. "You're not imagining things," he said, spreading papers across his kitchen table. "I've been documenting Cynthia's overreach for 2 years." My eyebrows shot up. 2 years? He nodded grimly, pointing to board meeting minutes and email printouts. There it was in black and white. Cynthia calling for bans on political signs that clearly violated free speech protections, attempting to force homeowners to apply for approval before planting trees on their own lawns, even floating fees, for improvements that never needed architectural review in the first place. Every single time she had acted on her own, stretching a volunteer position into a throne. and every single time the board had been forced, reluctantly, to reel her back in after disputes simmered. She always frames it like she's protecting property values, Mr. June explained. But none of this ever went to proper board votes or homeowner input. She just asserts authority and hopes people don't push back. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. You're the first one to challenge her so publicly. It's about time. From there, the pattern snapped into focus with frightening clarity. The Williams family had their own story ready the moment I knocked on their door. Cynthia had attempted to ban boats in driveways, claiming it harmed aesthetic harmony. They produced a printed exchange where they had to present their deed and even threaten legal action, before she backed down without apology. Instead, the correction was buried in the following month's newsletter like it was an afterthought. The Johnsons, 2 streets over, provided perhaps the most damning evidence. They had actual photographs, receipts, and bank records from when Cynthia hired landscaping crews to beautify community areas. Except those areas included part of their private yard. They came home to find workers tearing up flower beds, shrubs hauled out like weeds. The workers insisted Cynthia had authorized the project as community maintenance. The Johnsons ended up paying over $800 to stop the chaos, then fought with the HOA for reimbursement. The HOA eventually refunded them, but not before weeks of tension, stress, and a ruined garden. By evening, my own kitchen table was piled with copies of emails, retractions, and written testimony. Henderson's statement confirmed the legal risks. June had compiled a timeline of unauthorized proposals. The Williams family documented driveway battles and property violations. The Johnsons had hard proof, photographs, and financial records that Cynthia had treated their private space as communal land. That night, staring at the stack of evidence, one truth became impossible to ignore. My cabin retreat fiasco wasn't an accident, wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the latest episode in an ongoing series of power plays by someone convinced her title as HOA president gave her authority over people's lives and properties. Some neighbors chose silence, perhaps out of fear of rocking the boat. But at least 5 families stepped forward to back me. And every document painted an identical story, announced bold claims of authority, expect obedience, and only retreat when forced by law. Looking at that mountain of papers and testimony, I realized something critical. Saturday's confrontation at my locked gate would not just be about me defending a cabin. It would be about an entire neighborhood, finally holding one person accountable for 2 years of creeping overreach. For once, Cynthia would be facing something she couldn't dismiss or bury in the next month's newsletter. Written proof, community patterns, and neighbors who had found their voice. For a while, the fight over my property had been about principles and paperwork. Boundary maps, HOA bylaws, neighbors' testimonies, all of it was weighty but somewhat abstract. That changed the moment my phone lit up with the first vendor call. Suddenly, this wasn't about meetings and arguments anymore. It was about invoices, about real money. And in many ways, that was more terrifying than talk of trespassing. It was Rebecca Shaw, the neighbor who dabbled in freelance accounting, who first tipped me off. Early Sunday morning, she called in a hushed but urgent voice. Evan, she said, I think something's gone very wrong. I got CC'd on an email chain by accident. Vendors are expecting to deliver things to your cabin. Tables, tents, porta potties, catering, all of it invoiced in the neighborhood's name. Does any of that sound right to you? My coffee went cold in my hand. Vendor invoices? Actual financial commitments tied to my property? She wasn't exaggerating. She forwarded the chain right after our call, showing order confirmations listing my cabin address as the delivery point. By the time I hung up, the financial risk hit me harder than any HOA speech ever could. This wasn't just about unauthorized use. It wasn't hypothetical liability anymore. If people actually delivered equipment and services to my gate, they'd expect payment. And if they didn't get it, their invoices could easily roll into collections. Some companies didn't care who signed the order. If the material showed up with my address, I could be pulled into the mess. Sure enough, the calls began within 24 hours. First came the portable toilet company dispatcher. We have a delivery scheduled for your location, he said matter-of-factly. But the $300 transport and setup fee isn't authorized. Who's handling payment? I explained as patiently as I could that I was the property owner and had never approved their services. There was a pause on the line. Then, someone gave us this order. If they disappear, we're not eating the loss. His tone hardened. If we can't collect from your HOA, we'll have to recover costs from everyone involved with the event location. That single word, recover, summoned a dozen courthouse nightmares in my imagination. And more calls followed. A van rental company wanting to confirm pickup for group transportation, a tent supplier asking about ground setup permissions, a catering service eager for headcount confirmation. The numbers added up fast. $400 here, $600 there, $800 worth of food already prepped. By noon, I had tallied nearly $2,500 in vendor obligations tethered to my property address, with no valid payments anywhere in sight. It was almost surreal. Standing in my driveway, phone pressed to my ear, listening to professionals describe services I never requested, I realized I wasn't fighting rules anymore. I was fighting dollars, and worse, unpaid dollars. When I confronted Cynthia at the gate that week, the families who had arrived for the so-called retreat listened closely as I laid it all out. Confirmed vendor orders, pending invoices, the absence of authorization. I showed them my liability form, updated with hard math. Whoever claims authority here, I explained, must also accept responsibility. Delivery fees, cancellation penalties, unpaid balances. Real vendors, real money. As of today, that number could exceed $100,000 in exposure if accidents, cancellations, or lawsuits pile onto it. For the first time, I saw cracks in Cynthia's carefully practiced confidence. She'd strutted up in her sharp clothes, looking like she expected me to fold. But as she read the financial breakdown, her lips tightened. Parents began murmuring about medical bills, septic systems, event permits. An older man shook his head and muttered, "Somebody's going to bankrupt us all." That was the turning point. Up until then, Cynthia had been able to wield authority like a club. Announcements, newsletters, rules thrown around like scripture. But money doesn't lie. Vendors wanted payment. Companies didn't want theories. And no HOA newsletter in the world could erase numbers on an invoice. The more I dug, the worse it looked for her. Rebecca called back later with fresh details. Several vendors had already tried charging the HOA account and found it declined. Some were threatening late fees. Others were saying they'd cancel deliveries only if penalties were paid up front. The catering company sounded the angriest. "We made food for 100 people, their manager fumed. "That's $800 in perishables and labor. If we don't see payment, we're coming after whoever signed this order." At that point, it didn't take a lawyer to see where responsibility was heading. Whoever placed those vendor orders without authority wasn't setting up a community retreat. They were setting up a financial disaster. That evening, I added every invoice, phone note, and vendor detail into my growing documentation file. Where once I'd only had property deeds and survey maps, now I had spreadsheets. Names of companies, exact amounts owed, conversations logged with times and dates. It looked less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a criminal case file. By the time darkness fell, the truth was obvious. This wasn't just overreach anymore, it was reckless business fraud. Whatever Cynthia thought she was pulling, she had put herself, the HOA, and potentially every homeowner under the shadow of thousands of dollars in unpaid vendor commitments. Standing at the cabin gate that night, the tamper-proof lock gleaming under the porch light, I realized the fight had shifted again. First, it was about property rights. Then it became about community accountability. But now it was about money. And money was a battlefield where even the boldest HOA president couldn't fake strength for long. As the vendor chaos piled up, it was becoming painfully clear that this wasn't just about one mistaken newsletter anymore. A few angry phone calls could be brushed aside as miscommunication, but stacks of unpaid vendor obligations and thousands of dollars in pending invoices, that was hard legal reality. And in that reality, someone had to be held accountable. I knew if I didn't protect myself quickly, the HOA president's carelessness could land squarely on my shoulders. That's what sent me driving to the county courthouse that Friday morning. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I was looking for guidance. The records clerk guided me to recent civil cases, lawsuits involving HOAs, private property disputes, and unauthorized use of land. I sat at a long wooden table flipping through thick files, each case telling a story eerily similar to mine. One after another. Homeowners had been dragged into expensive battles because association leaders claimed authority they simply didn't have. One case in particular chilled me. Anderson vs. Pine Valley Association. The HOA president had booked vendors for a private backyard party, called it a community event, and then skipped out on the invoices when the homeowner objected. When vendors went unpaid, they sued the HOA and the president personally. The court ruled that because the president had acted without authority, she was individually liable for more than $15,000 in vendor payments, plus penalties. Reading that judgment, I felt the same cold weight in my stomach that I had felt when I first pulled the newsletter from my mailbox. Cynthia Pierce wasn't just overstepping her position. She was walking straight toward personal liability and dragging the rest of us with her. In case after case, the rulings were consistent. When HOA officers step beyond the powers outlined in bylaws, they stop representing the association. They act as individuals, and individuals are personally accountable for the financial damage they cause. That was the thread that tied every decision together. Show power wasn't infinite, even if Cynthia believed it was. It had boundaries, and every document, every bylaw, every precedent hammered home the same message. Armed with photocopies of these cases and a binder full of vendor invoices, neighbor statements, photos, and legal statutes, I asked Mrs. Henderson if her daughter, the real estate lawyer, could help us mediate formally. Thankfully, she agreed to act as a neutral guide. If we didn't try to mediate, the other option was to file a lawsuit, and lawsuits almost always end up costing everyone more time, money, and relationships than they're worth. The mediation was set for Tuesday at Mrs. Henderson's dining table. The room felt less like a friendly neighbor's home and more like a courtroom. Cynthia walked in, still projecting her trademark confidence, but there was a nervous rigidity in the way she set her purse down. Across the table, I spread my binder open. This time, it wasn't just me pointing to a deed and saying, "I own this." It was case law, vendor statements, signed witness documents, and over $2,400 in unpaid invoices that vendors were already threatening to send to collections. At first, Cynthia tried to argue the same lines as before, claiming community benefit, invoking association tradition, but Mrs. Henderson's daughter cut straight through it. "Intentions don't create authority," she said firmly. "Your HOA bylaws do not grant you the right to use private land as common property, nor to incur vendor debts without contracts. The cases are clear. You can be held personally accountable for every dollar vendors are owed." The moment that truly silenced the room was when I produced the legal easement, documents I had quietly put in place the year before. Not only did I own the cabin and surrounding acreage, but my LLC controlled the access road leading in. The easement was explicit: no commercial or group use without written authorization. In other words, Cynthia hadn't just ignored common sense. She had attempted to override a binding legal instrument. The weight of it seemed to sink in as she looked over the paperwork. For the first time, Cynthia's posture softened. She admitted quietly, "I never thought about the business side of planning an event. I just wanted to do something for the neighborhood. But intention doesn't erase liability, and by then everyone in the room knew it. So we turned the confrontation into a settlement. I could have pushed for legal damages, even punitive ones. Precedent supported it. But that battle would have left the community bruised for years. Instead, I proposed a resolution that focused more on repair than destruction. Cynthia would personally accept responsibility for reimbursing vendor costs through a structured payment plan. In addition, she would issue a written statement to the community admitting the overreach, acknowledging that private property rights had been violated. Most importantly, she agreed to work with Mrs. Henderson's daughter to draft a set of property rights and HOA guidelines for the entire neighborhood. 6 months later, that guide became our greatest victory. It outlined, in plain English, the limits of HOA authority, the distinction between common areas and private property, and the proper procedures for organizing community events. It even included flowcharts for vendor authorization and insurance requirements. What started as a nightmare at my cabin eventually became a protective shield for every homeowner in our county. Other HOAs even requested copies to educate their own boards before similar fiascos erupted. Standing at my cabin gate months later, I looked at the new signage we'd installed, clear markers showing where the public road stopped and private property began. The tamper-proof lock still swung on its chain, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to check it constantly. I had something stronger than steel wire holding the cabin safe now. I had precedent. I had community support. And I had peace. In the end, Cynthia's downfall wasn't a dramatic confrontation or an angry scream. It was paperwork. Cold, undeniable paperwork. And that is the most satisfying thing of all. That what once felt like intimidation, threats, and takeover collapsed under the weight of simple, steady truth.